Bonjour, Niganasque Indigenous, Dashkan TV, Dujaba, Ajijak, Dodum. And what I said was, hello, my name is Leading Light Woman. My English name is Jaimie. I'm from Chagwada-Tamas First Nations Reserve, which is also known as Dashkan Zibing. And I am from the Crane Clan. So today we're starting a new series from the same resource, pulling together. This one's called Foundations. So we're going right back to the basics here. In this, we're going to start with our introduction. So as I begin, once again, make sure that you're writing your questions or comments or just keeping track of any thoughts that you have as we go along, okay? So it's commonly claimed that Canada has two founding nations, the French and the English. And that's what I grew up learning in elementary. I learned about Louis Riel, Upper and Lower Canada. And when I did learn about my people, it wasn't necessarily my people. I learned about the Haudenosaunee people and the Iroquois people, not too much about Anishinaabe or Chippewa or Ojibwe people. And that was back in the 90s, so 96. The original people that we still exist, and we live all over Canada. From traditional territories to urban centers. Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make enormous contributions to Canadian society, politically, economically, and culturally. But as we're aware, too many Canadians don't know about this history. And the lack of awareness is a barrier to improving relationships between Canadians, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous. So what a lot of people don't realize is that treaty making wasn't just about Indigenous people, it was about non-Indigenous people as well. In this session, I hope that you will learn about the past and contemporary realities of Indigenous peoples. This is often a misunderstood history, but we believe that it is only through understanding of the past that we can create a better future. You'll also be learning about the different types of Indigenous nations, where we live, how we work, and the effects that colonization and assimilation has had on us since settlers came over. So I included this because it's one of my favorite pictures. It's from the Toronto Zoo. They worked extensively with their Indigenous community in that area, and they have a lot of resources. I would endorse them and support them. I took this picture from one of their resources because this is what I grew up learning. So if you went through the slide, this one, you would know that Turtle Island is the name the Lenape, Iroquois, and Anishinaabe and other woodland nations gave to North America. So the name comes from a creation story. That's what we call it. And each nation has their own separate creation story. Haudenosaunee creation story is different from Anishinaabe creation story. But there's a lot of similar elements within both of them. As well as with, I've noticed, with Christianity in the way of a flood, animals and their role and how they helped Turtle Island come to be. But Turtle Island specifically involves one of my favorite animals, and that's the muskrat. This is from the Anishinaabe creation story. So it was the muskrat who was able to go down and get that little piece of dirt in his paw, brought it back up. In some versions, he makes it, and in some versions, he doesn't make it. But when they take that dirt from his paw, they spread it across the back of the turtle, and that's how you got North America. And if we see North America from outer space, it takes the shape of a turtle. So looking at this slide, I want you to imagine a society, maybe Canada, and we'll call it Northern Turtle Island. Imagine when people came off the airplane, they were met by Indigenous people, not a customs person. And when we look at traditional ways of entering here in Canada, there was a whole protocol of ceremony and approach. I know that with the stereotypes and with what was written in previous history books, there was this romanticized version of what happened. But really, coming to a new land, settlers didn't know how to take care of themselves. And that's where Indigenous peoples, they stepped up and they, what is your intent in coming? And I'm pretty sure the conversation would have been, we're running from oppression, because they were running from oppression in their own country, religious prosecution, and numerous other things. And when they came over here and met the Indigenous peoples, are you coming for peace? I'm pretty sure in the beginning they were coming for peace. And if they had said they were coming here for their family and that their family is struggling, which most European families that came over, settlers that came over, they were struggling. We need help to make money for them. Indigenous people would welcome them, and they'd help them get a job, and they'd help them get what they need, and they would teach them about the real name of this continent, Turtle Island, and about the territory they've entered. And that's from Curtis Clear Sky. He's Blackfoot and Anishinaabe First Nations. I thought it was important to include this picture and that quote, that story, because it's a really tricky relationship between helping and being romanticized as you're in that role helping. And that's something that I think has done a disservice to Indigenous nations throughout history. It's kind of distorted the history. So, introduction to Indigenous peoples. This resource is based out of British Columbia, so I've had to use a lot of knowledge that concerns this territory in this area, Windsor, Essex, and probably beyond Windsor, Essex, because Anishinaabe land territory goes a little ways past Amherstburg and a little ways almost all the way up to Toronto. This is my uncle, and he's working on a rib for a Gmod, a canoe. And he, previous to this, he didn't have any teachings about how to make a canoe. And he's I would consider him an elder, but if he heard me say that, he would be really upset. But and he's relearning this part of his culture that was lost to him. And that's why I included that picture, because this is in this territory, from what I'm seeing in my community, this is what we're reclaiming. We're reclaiming our natural resources, our natural skills, our natural talents, our natural roles and responsibilities. And it's been quite a journey so far. So what will you be learning about? Are we Aboriginal or Indigenous? You're going to be learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada, specifically First Nations, Métis, Inuit, urban Indigenous peoples. I'm going to show you some demographics, and we're going to talk a little bit about acknowledging traditional territories, which I know is a hot topic, and I've been asked why I don't acknowledge traditional territories when I open up, and it's because I haven't written an acknowledgement yet that I feel suits my role and responsibilities here. Because when I write that acknowledgement, I want action to be followed by it. So it's not just empty words, and it's not just a box checked off. So I've asked you to locate yourself through activity 1. I've asked you to reflect on the area, city, and town where you live. Do a little bit of research. Whose traditional First Nations territory do you currently live, work, and play? How do you know this? And if you don't know, spend some time researching this online. So for me, we're on Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee traditional territory with guests from Potawatomi, Odawa, and other nations. I know this because that's what was taught to me, and that's what I looked up. So I asked you to do a knowledge check and to record your own answers because we're going to be going through this again at the end, granted that we have the time to do so. But how many First Nations are there in Canada? And I know the answers, so it'll be interesting to see your answers at the end. I'm not going to give them right now. The term First Nations and Indigenous Peoples have the same meaning? True or false? The two First Nations that are in Wawiatonan territory are the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. True or false? And the last one, to be recognized as a Métis citizen in Ontario, one must, this is multiple choice, self-identify, apply through local or provincial Métis organization, provide documentation, proof of ancestry, or all of the above. So, Aboriginal or Indigenous? Section 35, subsection 2 of the Constitution Act 1982 defined Aboriginal peoples in Canada as including the Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. These terms will be explained as we progress through this session. Some of them have changed and are changing. For example, Indian. It is now considered offensive and has been replaced by First Nations. We are hearing the term Indigenous more and more. It is being used synonymously with Aboriginal, and in many cases, it is the preferred term as the collective noun for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. There's many reasons for this shift. One reason is that the prefix "ab" means away from. Paul Patatagus, who taught beginning times teachings at the Faculty of Education, gives a teaching in this word-specific Aboriginal, and he doesn't like the word. He's shared that with me many times, and this is why, because it means away from or not. So Aboriginal actually means not original. Indigenous comes from the Latin word indigenea, which means sprung from the land, native. And Indigenous peoples recognize that rather than a single group of people, there are many separate and unique nations. That's from Ward. And I think a lot of people don't realize that Anishinaabe is different from Haudenosaunee. Tribes over in the States, Lakota, Dakota, those are different tribes that are from here, but we're still on Turtle Island. Their teachings would be different from my teachings, just the same as my teachings are different from the teachings out in British Columbia, where this resource came from. So it's important to note we're not all the same. We don't all come from the same nation. There are specific nations that we come from. So in Canada, the accepted term for people who are Indigenous and do not identify as Inuit or Métis is First Nations. In the past, these people were referred to as Indians. Today, Indians considered offensive, colonial, and should not be used. First Nations have lived and thrived since time immemorial on this land, now called Canada. We've had many languages, cultures, and traditions, and spiritual beliefs. And historically, we've managed our land and resources with our own governments, our own laws, policies, and practices. So today, there are around 630 different First Nations communities across Canada, about half of which are in British Columbia and Ontario. According to the 2016 census, there were over 70 distinct Indigenous languages recognized across the country. And UNESCO's World Atlas of Languages in Danger recognizes over 80 distinct Indigenous languages in Canada, including those that no longer have speakers. Frequently asked questions about First Nations. How many First Nations people are there? Well, they make up the largest group of Indigenous peoples in Canada. In 2016, there were 977,230 First Nations people in Canada. We don't fill out those consensus forms. I believe reserves didn't start filling those out until 2016. I may be wrong, but I grew up on the reserve, and I don't ever remember filling out a consensus form asking me about where I live, if I work, anything like that. So this is fairly new data, even though it's in 2016. So slide 15 asks, where do First Nations people live? First Nations people live in every province and territory. The largest First Nations populations are in Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. However, while First Nations people living in these provinces accounted for less than 4% of the total provincial populations in 2011, they represent almost 1/3 of the total population of the Northwest Territories and almost 1/5 of the total population of the Yukon. Do all First Nations people live on reserves? No. Many First Nations live off reserve, and I've used my own reserve as an example there. So the total registered population of my reserve is 2,420. This is old data, so there's probably the population has risen, and the total on reserve population is half of that. So with half of the registered members, living off reserve, that means that we're everywhere. And this is not just for my reserve. This is for a lot of other reserves too, because it's hard to get a house if you don't have land. If you don't have a house, you're homeless. So I know for myself, I came to Windsor because of two things: housing and education. I wanted to get my education so that I could provide for my son. And I wanted my son to have a good education too, because the education on reserves is not the same as education that you would get off reserve. So, is it okay to use the word Indian to describe First Nations people? The term Indian refers to the legal identity of a First Nations person who is registered under the Indian Act. And if you don't know about the Indian Act, I strongly suggest you go and you research it. It's a very, very dense document. It's probably going to take you some time to get through it and understand it. I still don't understand all of it myself. But when I asked my grandmother about this, I said, they still call us Indian on the status card. And my grandmother, this was her reply to me. She said the government could call me an Indian. That is what it says on my status card. And until that language changes, it's the government that can use that term. Anybody else called her an Indian, they would have got a severe talking to, or maybe some choice words. But for the most part, it's a term that is, I don't feel a strong way about it. My dad used North American Indian when we would cross the border, because he told me that if we don't say it like that, we lose it. The government will find a way to take it from us. And I believe him. I still believe him to this day. So within Canada, it's considered outdated and offensive. And you may notice some other terms, like I've said, North American Indian, Native Indian, are still in current and common use in the United States. Not so much over here. Over here, I hear a lot of Aboriginal, First Nations, and now I'm starting to hear Indigenous a lot more. Some First Nations people in Canada will refer to themselves as Indians, but like I said, it's the federal government still calls it Indian and Indian because of the Indian Act. There's still an Indian Act. It's not called the Aboriginal Act or the Indigenous Act. It's called the Indian Act. But Indian is a term you should not use. So I provided a couple of pictures of what a status card looks like. I have the one on the right. I don't have the one on the left. There was a little bit of concern when the new status cards came out because of that language, the English language, and what it actually meant to go from the red status card to the blue plastic white status card. But as you can see, it says Indian and Northern Affairs, Certificate of Indian Status. So that language for the government hasn't changed yet. And to get that language changed, you would have to, the Indian Act would have to be abolished, and there would have to be the treaties and the other agreements that were made with separate nations in the place of the act. That's as far as it's gone. I feel like the conversation has gone in terms of why don't we just get rid of the Indian Act? Well, the Indian Act provides protection of land, resources, the personhood of the Indigenous people and their community. So it's not just as easy as saying, get rid of the Indian Act. There's a lot that has to be considered, mainly the treaties, but some nations don't have treaties. So what does that mean? So a person is recognized by the federal government as being registered under the Indian Act, who's referred to as a status Indian. And being a status Indian means that there's a certain entitlement to certain programs and services offered by federal agencies and provincial governments. There have been many rules for deciding who is eligible for registration as an Indian under the Indian Act. Significant changes were made to legislation in 1951, 1985. My cousin Dal Riley was a big part of the 1985 Section 35. He had a role in forming that, and I hope to bring him as a guest in the future. And there was another change to the Indian Act that was made in 2011. People who identify as Indians but who are not entitled to registration on the Indian Register under the Indian Act are referred to as non-status Indians. Some of them may be members of a First Nation, even though the federal government does not recognize them as status Indians. And I just want you to take a second to think about that last sentence. Even though the federal government does not recognize them as status Indians. The federal government is sitting on Indigenous territory, Parliament Hill. They have no connections, no ties to Indigenous communities that they're talking about. So it's really quite frustrating to have a foreign entity determine who our people are, when we know who our people are through the community, through family relations, ties, through ceremony, through language. We know who our people are. This is a very popular one. Do First Nations people pay taxes? It's a common misconception. So remember when I showed you those stats of my reserve? Over half of registered members live off. So that means over half of registered members are paying taxes. And if over half of my people are paying taxes, then chances are it's over half paying taxes on other reserves too. So it's a common misconception that we don't pay federal or provincial taxes. Under certain circumstances, status Indians can be exempted from paying tax. So for example, income earned on a reserve can be tax exempt, which means you'll get your full paycheck. I know I don't get a full paycheck here. There's quite a big chunk taken off. Or any goods and services purchased by a status Indian on a reserve and delivered to them on a reserve are sales tax exempt. So I can give you an example of that. When I go out and buy a new car from a dealership, I can have that car delivered to the reserve so I don't have to pay GST or PST. Most furniture, I believe, too, you can get delivered. But as for off reserve, I pay the taxes on my furniture. I pay the taxes on goods and services. I rarely use my status card, even though I'm told I should use it before I lose it, which I don't believe in. But It's a personal choice by Indigenous people whether they choose to use their status card or not use their status card to get those exemptions. So, do First Nations people get free housing? No, we don't. But it's a complicated system. There's two main categories of housing on reserve: market-based housing and nonprofit social housing. Market-based housing refers to households paying the full cost associated with purchasing or renting their house. This is not free housing. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Agency delivers housing programs and services to all Canadians across the country under the National Housing Act. For here in Windsor, there's Can-Am Urban Native Homes, and they help with housing. And there's other co-op programs. I know there's a couple in London that will help you secure housing, affordable housing at that. But part of my struggle with this is I have land, but it's on an undeveloped road. So if I chose to build a house on my reserve, I'd have to pay for the hydro. I'd have to pay for the water line to go there. I'd also have to pay to get the road developed, and that would come out of my pocket. So I don't know what I would be left with to build a house. But I'm hoping in the future that that road does get developed and I will eventually be able to build a house on my land. Another thing is I'd have to go through the band office and get approval for a housing plan. So it's not like I just go out and pick out the housing plan that I want. They have housing plans they make you choose from. And again, that comes from the federal government. That doesn't come from my people. It's from the federal government. This is another popular one. Do First Nation students get free post-secondary education? Some students do and some students don't. I got funding one year. The next year I didn't. I had to pay a student loan back. It just depends on the financial structure and situation of the band that the student comes from. So some bands have long waiting lists for education, funding for education. And some bands are good because they have land claims, they have trusts set up from those land claims, and they're able to help their people with bursaries or scholarships through that way. But ultimately, it just depends on the First Nation that the student belongs to. First Nations culture. Culture is an expression of a community's worldview and unique relationship with the land. Indigenous cultures across Canada are diverse, but there are commonalities among them. Traditionally, their societies have been communal. Every member had roles and responsibilities. There was equality between men and women. Nature was valued. Life was cyclical. You'll learn more below about the significant characteristics of First Nations culture. So there's education. Traditional Indigenous education is different from European-style education. Children learn with their families and immediate community. Learning is ongoing and does not take place at specific times. Children learn how to live, survive, participate in, and contribute to their community. They are encouraged to take part in everyday activities alongside adults to watch and listen, and then eventually practice what they have learned. Education is a lifelong process, continuing as people grow into different roles: child, youth, adult, and elder. My grandma she went to residential school. So the way I grew up, because my dad, she took care of my dad, she taught my dad stuff, but the way I grew up was children are to be seen, not heard. And that's from her residential experience. Community. Indigenous cultures were traditionally inclusive. Linda Gray from the Shimshunian First Nation writes, everybody had a place in community despite their gender, physical or mental ability, sexual orientation, or age. Women, elders, two-spirit, children, and youth were an integral part of healthy and vibrant community. Elders. In Indigenous cultures, elders are cherished and respected. An elder is not simply an older or elderly person, but is usually someone who is very knowledgeable about history, values, and teachings of his or her culture. Some elders are young, 20. Some of them are even younger, 10. We've recognized that they have some innate wisdom, whether it's blood memory or what have you, but we recognize that that wisdom in them is valuable, and we try to nurture that and support it so that it grows. Further knowledge, wisdom, and behavior. Elders are valuable role models and teachers for all members of community. Elders play an important role in maintaining the tradition of passing along oral histories. Oral traditions. First Nations pass along values, family, and community histories through oral storytelling. Just recently, I took a trip to Peterborough petroglyphs, and they have it in a great big glass house. I thought you could just walk up to the rocks and maybe not walk on them, but just, walk around them. And I have to say that the connection to that spot and that time and that space was really overwhelming and powerful. Just to see something left behind for me and for the next 7 generations after me, I hope, for people to go and learn and see that we had a way. We had a way of communicating. We had a way of storytelling. We had community and social structures that were in play, and we knew a lot about a lot of stuff. We knew, Mother Earth, Turtle Island taught us a lot. So ownership. Each Indigenous culture and community, even family, has its own historical and traditional stories, songs, or dances. Different cultures have different rules about ownership. Some songs, names, and symbols and dances only belong to some people or families and cannot be used, retold, danced, or sung without permission. Sometimes they are given to someone in ceremony. Other songs and dances are openly shared. So if you've ever been to a powwow, that's something that's openly shared. Those songs and that beat of that drum is shared with you. But when I go to Sundance, this is just an example. I haven't been to Sundance. When I go to Sundance, that's private. That's between me and the creator. And that's something that wouldn't be shared. So the Métis. I'm not Métis. I'm Anishinaabe. So I'm just speaking to what was included in this resource. But once again, I hope to have Donna Grayer come in. She used to be the president of the Métis Council, Chatham-Kent. I'm hoping she could come in and share some time with you all as well. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many French and Scottish men migrated to Canada to work in the fur trade. So the French mixed families and their descendants were most often referred to as Métis, from the French word to mix. The Scottish mixed families and their descendants were referred to as half-breeds. Today, the term half-breed is considered offensive and no longer used. So again, Métis is specific to French and Indigenous people. I've met quite a few people who believe they're Métis if they're Black and Indigenous mixed, or if they're another nationality and Indigenous mixed. Métis is specific. There is a specific culture, there's a specific language, and there's a specific territory that they're from. So frequently asked questions. Who are they? What is the Métis Nation? And can anybody be Métis? So Métis are one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. They're identified in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. Métis people who are Indigenous do not identify as First Nations or Inuit. The Métis Nation Council defines Métis as a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Indigenous peoples, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation. What is the Métis Nation? It comprises of Métis citizens who descend from a historic Métis homeland. Can anyone be a Métis citizen? No. Self-identification is one of 4 criteria that each Métis citizen must meet to register with the nation. This concept of Métis identity is complicated by those who self-identify as Métis because of their longing to belong to one of the constitutional Aboriginal groups in Section 35, subsection 1, but cannot claim Indian status or assert their Inuit ancestries. Many of these individuals believe their mixed ancestry justifies their claim to be Métis. As we have seen in the definition of who is Métis, there are individuals who are not in turn accepted by the Métis Nation because they have no connection to the historic homeland or any ancestral ties. So what does it mean to be a Métis citizen? And I've included some links in the PowerPoint for you to explore. R versus Pauli is further defined in the Section 35 term of Métis. The Pauli story. So Métis does not encompass all individuals with mixed and Indian and European heritage. Rather, it refers to distinctive peoples who, in addition to their mixed ancestry, develop their own customs, way of life, and recognizable group identities separate from their Indian or Inuit and European forebears. Métis communities evolved and flourished prior to the entrenchment of European control, when the influence of European settlers and political institutions became preeminent. How many Métis are there? In 2016, 587,445 people identify as Métis. That represents 32.3% of the total Indigenous population and 1.4% of the total Canadian population. Do Métis people pay taxes? They're not exempt from paying the PST, the provincial sales tax, or the goods and services tax. Métis people in Canada contribute over $1 billion in taxes each year. Do they get free education? No. But the Métis Nation of Ontario and the other Métis nations across Canada, they have a post-secondary fund that Métis students can apply to, and it's through the Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Program. So Métis culture, it's very different from First Nations and Inuit cultures. The red Voyager sash that we've seen is recognized as part of a distinct Métis culture. It is part of the clothing worn by Métis people every day and had many uses, such as a holder, washcloth, bridle, or saddle blanket. And it's worn by Métis people today in celebration of their culture and identity. There's a Métis flag that has a blue background with a white infinity symbol, and it depicts the joining of two cultures and the existence of people forever. Kinship connections. I included the links that there for you to explore this. I myself, I was fascinated by it because I had never seen it like this before. I've heard Donna talk about it, and I've heard other Métis people in leadership roles talk about it as well. But to see it there and laid out, it makes me happy because I didn't know. I have to be honest and say I didn't know that these kinship connections existed. And so I'm exploring that myself as well. Métis Nation is a self-governing nation. The governance structure includes 7 geographic regions and 37 Métis chartered communities. The Inuit, they're Indigenous people. They live in the Arctic regions of Canada, Greenland, and Alaska, and Russia. Inuit have lived here and lived there and thrived in the Arctic for thousands of years. Traditionally, they lived off the resources of the land, hunting whales, seals, caribou, fish, and birds. Many Inuit continue to harvest these resources today. They existed prior to contact, and the Inuit is the accepted term for people who are Indigenous and do not identify as First Nations and Métis. So Inuit are different from First Nations and Métis. Again, a lot of people don't know that. They just kind of group us all together. The Inuit way of life and culture changed when Inuit made contact with European explorers. And they later began participating in the fur trade. And it changed again about 1950 and 1970 when the government of Canada moved many Inuit communities away from the traditional hunting and gathering sites and their mobile way of life into a permanent centralized settlements. And we see the effects of that today with the high rates of drug abuse and suicide. I remember a few years back, I was seriously pondering going up there to see if I could help while they were going through their suicide crisis. And then historically, Inuit were referred to as Eskimos. Now, there's a big to do in the media today with the Edmonton Eskimos and that name, but historically they were referred to as Eskimos, and then they put Esquimaux. But this term is neither accurate or respectful and should not be used. The term Inuit, singular Inuit, means the people in the Inuktitut language. So the frequently asked questions about Inuits: where do they live? They live in 53 communities across northern regions of Canada, mostly along the Arctic coast. How many are there? There's approximately 65,000 Inuit that live in Canada, according to the 2016 census. Majority live in Nunavut, with smaller numbers in the other three regions of Inuit Nunavut, as well as a small number living in the urban centers in southern Canada. So like I said before, are Inuit First Nations? Well, Canada's Constitution, Section 35, recognizes three groups of Indigenous people: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Three groups of Indigenous peoples. There are separate peoples with unique heritages, languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. The Inuit are indeed distinct from First Nations and Métis groups. What language do they speak? Their language is made up of a variety of dialects. They do not live on reserves, but in contemporary communities. They do not live in igloos unless they are sleeping overnight on the land. Do they have land claims? Yes. They have land claim agreements that have been signed in all four Inuit regions, which I didn't know. Nunavut in 1975, and there was, and I'm not going to say these names right, Inuit in 1984, Nunavut in 1983, and Nunavut in 2005. So under their respective land claim agreements, Inuit were granted title to certain blocks of land. These four land claim regions cover about 40% of Canada's land mass. Do Inuit pay taxes? Yes, they are tax-paying citizens of Canada. Who are they, Inuit? Inuit are a First Nation in Eastern Canada. They are not Inuit. The Inuit culture, they've lived on Nunavut, the land, water, and ice since time immemorial. They continue to do so to this day. Culture and oral traditions are based on sharing, cooperation, respect for the land, animals, fish, and peoples. Government and communities. Once those land agreements were signed, government organizations were formed to manage land claim implementation. So the ones that I just named off, they all have their own corporation. So there's the Nunavut Government Makvik Corporation. There's the national organization Inuit Taprit Natami, who I've been in contact with before. There are elders regarded and respected as knowledge keepers and advisors. And I just want you to be aware of the role that elders, how we regard them and how we hold them to our culture and our community. As advisors, elders ensure that everybody's voice is heard in the decision making to ensure survival. Knowledge of the land is important, and the continuance of family structures and the rites of passage is just one of the contributions that elders make to maintaining Inuit communities today using oral tradition. Slide 32, you can see the Inuit Year. And I couldn't find, because a colleague of mine We developed a Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee calendar, and I can't find it. I would have loved to have shown you what our calendar looks like. But again, it's circular, um, and it goes by the seasons, and it also goes by the land. So if you see around the outside of the circle, it says season of the seal pups, season of the igloo, year long harvest. I mean, I've never seen it laid out like this. So when I was reading about this, I just thought this was something that I would have loved to have seen growing up in elementary. I would have loved learning about this. I mean, if you look at how intricate it is, but yet it's simple. I would have loved learning about it. So this diagram highlights Inuit knowledge, the movement of resources, and changes to land and sea. This knowledge is passed on through oral traditions and time spent on land. Language. There are numerous dialects of Inuktitut with varying levels of speaker fluency. Dialects are nuances in a language that reflect a specific location and community. So there are two styles. I included one here, syllabics in Roman orthography. And syllabics use symbols to represent sounds rather than letters. Or Roman orthography uses the English alphabet to sound out the words. Urban and Indigenous peoples. So this is where I shine, because I've been urban since I was about 2 years old. In 2016, there were almost 900,000 Indigenous people living in urban areas. The largest urban Indigenous populations are in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. I moved to the city because I was seeking employment and educational opportunities. Some have lived in cities for generations. For others, the transition from rural areas or reserves to urban settings is still very new. Many Canadian cities occupy the traditional territories and reserves of First Nations. For example, and I believe this was just in the news, Vancouver lays on the traditional territory of Musqueam, Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh Nations, as well as over in the States. I believe there was a tribe there that got a lot of their land back. Was that in Oklahoma? You're welcome. So most of the urban Indigenous peoples consider the city they live in to be their home. However, for many, it is also important to keep a close connection to the Indigenous community of the origin. So for me, it's important that I go back to Tukwila First Nations to visit, see my mom, maybe go to ceremonies or participate in community activities and events. Connection to these communities, well, it did help me retain my traditional and contemporary Anishinaabe culture. I've included some stats from Windsor. So as you can see here, and I'm sorry, I can't see because I still have half a screen. And I'll let that sit with you. But I thought it would be important to include that so you could get a visual of the urban Indigenous people in Canada, in Windsor. I included this because I wanted you to see that when you Google urban Indigenous in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, Can-Am Urban Native Homes comes up, Can-Am Indian Friendship Center will come up. I don't know if ACRC is down there, but we're here. We're here. And we have services and programs that we run for Indigenous peoples who are urban. Demographics. I'm not a stats girl, but I thought it was important to also include this so that you would have a visual and you could have something to compare. Total Canadians, total Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I think it's a pretty good visual of the population. There were more than 1.67 million Indigenous people in Canada that represent 4.9% of the total population. That's up from 3.8% in 2006. We are one of the fastest growing populations in Canada. And I think that's evident through the self-identification process that most boards have enacted right now. So where do Indigenous peoples in Canada live? Well, the largest First Nations population is here in Ontario with 236,680, followed by British Columbia and Alberta. But according to the 2011 census, First Nations people living in Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta accounted for less than 4% of the total provincial populations. However, First Nations people accounted for 32.7% of the total populations of Northwest Territories, 19.8% of the total population of Yukon, and about 10% of the population of Manitoba, and that of Saskatchewan. In Nunavut, First Nations people account for 34% of the 0.34% of the population. Quebec, nearly 3/4 of First Nations people are registered as status Indians living on reserve, the highest proportion among the provinces. This was followed by New Brunswick, 68.8%, and Nova Scotia, 68.0%, in Ontario, 37.0% of the First Nations people with registered Indian status lived on reserve, the second lowest proportion among the provinces after Newfoundland and Labrador. Métis people live in every province and territory in the country, but in 2016, the majority lived in Ontario, 120,585. And the Western provinces had 351,020. But the Métis population is the fastest growing in Quebec and the Atlantic provinces. The majority of Inuit live in Nunavut, followed by Nunavik, and in Nunavut, Nunatsiavut, and another 17,690 Inuit live outside of Inuit Nunagat, many in urban centers and in southern Canada, including Ottawa, Edmonton, Montreal. Ottawa-Gatineau had the largest Inuit population. When I used to work for the Board of Ed, I was there for 8 years. I met 2 Inuit kids. And I still talk to them to this day. They're adopted. Their adopted mom was looking for resources and supports for them. And I was able to help them find some resources and support, but reaching out to their people up in Nunavut was quite the experience. When we're acknowledging traditional territories, there's a lot of work that goes into it. For me, like I said in the beginning, it's not just saying this is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and our guests, Potawatomi and Odawa peoples. And I'm still working on it. I will have an acknowledgement eventually, but I just think that sometimes that these traditional, these acknowledgements are done for kind of dressing up. So look at what we're doing. We have a traditional acknowledgement, but then that's where it ends. A traditional acknowledgement goes beyond the words. You have to have action with the words. And if you're not going to have action with the words, then I'm going to say, welcome to Anishinaabe territory. I'm glad you're here, but that's where it stops, because I don't know the intent of writing an acknowledgement for this traditional territory. When I know where the intent is going, I'll have a better grasp at how to word this acknowledgement. I know some people have done that. They do that in their email, and I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm actually really glad that people are doing that. But at the same time, to me, that signifies that you're an ally and that you're willing to push back against traditional post-secondary structures. Again, I'm developing my acknowledgement, but there's been discussion about whose traditional territory. I know that Greater Essex has, they rushed their Indigenous protocol but they wanted to do it in such a way that they would make everybody happy. And, you're not going to make everybody happy, um, but you have to do what is right. And the way I grew up and what I learned is that this is the Anishinaabe territory that we shared with Haudenosaunee peoples after they were run out of Oneida, Wisconsin, and New York and that area. And we took them in and we shared our resources with them. Of course, it didn't all happen like rainbows and butterflies. There was conflict. There was battles fought over land, but ultimately, when I asked my cousin about how do we know that this is our traditional territory, he told me to consult an elder who has birch bark scrolls that record, that has a record of whose territory this is. And for me, that's good enough. So to conclude, even though it was a little bit rushed, I hope I gave you some new information that you didn't have before. I encourage you to explore the links. And go back and do your knowledge check and test yourself and mark yourself and see how well your knowledge, if I helped you or if I didn't help you. If I further confused you, please just drop me an email. I'd be happy to sit down with you and discuss further. My laptop's an open book, I guess. And I know some of you have to go. That's fine. The session has been recorded. It'll be available later, I believe. And I thank you all for your